In this podcast extra, Lesley and I speak to Liam MacArthur MSP about the Assisted Dying for Terminally Ill Adults Bill currently making its way through the Scottish Parliament.
Well, this morning is a special podcast, and it is with Liam MacArthur, who's the Lib Dem MSP for the Orkney Islands. The reason we're looking at this is because he's also the sponsor of a private member's bill on assisted dying, which has been moving its way through the Scottish Parliament for, I don't know, is it 2 years now, actually, Liam?
It was introduced, March of 2 years ago, but the process itself really got underway very shortly after the last election. And so I made the announcement I was intending to consult on proposals for a bill in June 2021. So this is a process that really has lasted the duration of a 5-year session of the Scottish Parliament.
Right. Well, that might be one beginning of an answer about the level of scrutiny this has had, but we'll talk more through it. Just to be clear from the beginning, the reason we're doing this is because I think someone in your office heard the last podcast we did. I have to say, was quite upset in it because I had just had yet another friend die who had asked me to kill him. And it stops your life. It stops you in your tracks. It's appalling, actually. And I'm sure there can't be a person now who hasn't had, especially as you get older yourself, that hasn't watched a friend or a relative or your partner have a death that you would not wish on anybody. And it really makes you think then in a more focused way about this issue. That's probably what prompted us getting in touch. But Fraser has also had experience of this in a different way because you worked for Margot MacDonald back in the day.
Yeah, well, I campaigned for her. I campaigned for Margot in 2007 and 2011. So 2007 was her first run as an independent. I wasn't a member of any party at that point, and I was in university in Glasgow, but I just kind of really, I think everybody was very drawn to Margot's style. So came through to Edinburgh to campaign for her. And then in 2011, when she had the second bill go through, I helped produce a website and publish the bill responses and things like that, and gave some help to Peter Warren, that you'll probably know, Liam, that's, I think it's the director now of Friends at the End Europe. So it's something that I suppose I've always been in favour of. It's something that, my father, my grandpa always kind of had as a kind of joke or a kind of, low-level discussion, nothing too serious. My dad always says he wants a blue pill and a Nebuchadnezzar of champagne, and, nothing, not a Magnum or anything, and a Nebuchadnezzar, one of the big boys. But, it does feel like a sort of reasonably Scottish thing, a kind of Presbyterian thing almost, just that, sensible option to have, and not wanting to suffer through a kind of indignity in death. And that's why I suppose that some of the other campaign groups are called Dignity in Dying. It's just allowing people to have that comfort. And as we've seen in other jurisdictions, even if they don't actually utilise it, it sometimes gives people a lot of relief that they have that option, that they don't have to take things all the way to a very extreme end point, and that they have options.
Sorry to interrupt here. Fraser, you're just slightly popping. So if you could just sit back a tiny bit, that would be great. Liam, just to come in at that point, since we're all having our, personal reasons for getting involved in this, what's your reason for picking this?
Increasingly, I've come to the conclusion I'm one of the few people that doesn't have that very direct experience of losing a family member or a close personal friend to a so-called bad death, whether it's a painful death or one that just involves an awful lot of existential suffering in the final weeks and months. But I've certainly been now made aware of so many of those personal stories. And I think Fraser talks about the previous bill just over a decade ago that the Parliament dealt with, and ultimately voted down at stage one. And I think there's a number of differences and changes that have happened over that intervening period. One is the fact that more and more people have that personal experience. And in the consultation on the proposals that I put out to consultation at the end of 2021, which received the highest level of response for any member's bill in the history of the Scottish Parliament, just over 14,000 responses, overwhelmingly in favour, which again, I think just reiterated what's been shown in kind of polls over the last couple of decades. But what I think was more striking still was the number of personal stories that people wanted to tell, either people who'd lost a loved one to a bad death, or indeed individuals with a terminal illness who were desperate for a change in the law to allow for more choice. Whether or not they chose to access that, as Fraser says, in other jurisdictions, we often see around a third of people who make a request for an assisted death don't ultimately go through with it, but it provides that kind of peace of mind that they are looking for. The other thing is that we've seen now a number of jurisdictions around the world take forward legislation over that 10-year period. And I think we've also seen a shift in the opinion within the medical community as well. So a number of the main medical representative bodies now have taken a stance of neutrality on this, whereas the likes of the BMA, for example, have traditionally been opposed to a change in the law. So I think we've seen a shift. There feels an inevitability to this just because of the number of instances that are arising. And yes, it may be that those slightly older have had more experience of this, but certainly the last 4 years or so have taught me that young people as well can be equally traumatized by the loss of a family member or a friend to a bad death, and they themselves have stories too. So this is an issue that cuts across political divides, across religious faith, between the disabled and non-disabled community, and indeed in all age groups and in all parts of the country. This is a change that needs to happen, and I think that groundswell we've seen over the last few years hopefully will allow Parliament then to take the decision in this session to change the law.
Yes, I've got to say that last occasion when there were two younger women present, everyone walked out and asked me, where's the assisted dying bill at in Scotland? It was an immediate connection, to just not want that to happen to anybody else. But just so I think that's probably right, actually, that people in principle, people are thinking, well, actually, then of course it comes down to the detail and the safeguards. So there are kind of cautionary, well, there is probably the cautionary example is Canada, which gets raised, but let's raise it because it does seem to have got it's moved its definition of what constitutes a terminal illness. And that seems to have, well, let's not get into opening floodgates, but it's certainly got a larger number of people who've applied than other jurisdictions, as you say. So what are the safeguards for Scotland?
Well, let me just touch on the different models of assisted dying we see in different jurisdictions around the world. There are no two laws that are exactly the same, as is entirely appropriate. That they are tailored to fit the kind of circumstances in different states and countries in those jurisdictions. But there are two broad models. There is the more expansive model of assisted dying that we've seen for many, many years in places like Belgium and the Netherlands. And more recently in Canada, and I'll come back to Canada, and then a more tightly defined, restricted eligibility criteria around terminal illness and mental capacity that was first introduced in the state of Oregon in the US in 1996, 1997, and has subsequently been introduced in about a dozen states, most recently in New York at the end of last year. And then across all of the states in Australia and New Zealand, it's the model that has informed my thinking and drafting of my bill. Similarly, Kim Ledbetter's bill that's been considered at Westminster, and indeed the two pieces of legislation in the Isle of Man and Jersey. And in the Isle of Man, they've actually passed this legislation. So that terminal illness mental capacity model is, I think, the one we're seeing more often. I think in terms of Canada, and I understand why certainly opponents to assisted dying constantly want to refer to the example of Canada as somehow a kind of foretaste of what would happen here, where it introduced it could not be more different. In a sense, that legislation arose as a result of a legal challenge to the Supreme Court in Canada. On the basis of the Canadian Constitution, it was determined it was unconstitutional for there not to be this right to an assisted death. So it was never based on terminal illness. Parliamentarians, in a sense, were dragged kicking and screaming to pass legislation that was insufficient in meeting the court ruling. A challenge was made and successfully upheld, and the Canadian parliamentarians were then forced to go further in terms of expanding the criteria. But that is a piece of legislation that isn't defined, isn't restricted to terminal illness. It does refer to aspects of suffering, which obviously can be very subjective. I've sought to steer clear of that for good and obvious reasons. It's probably worth still acknowledging that in Canada, the legislation continues to enjoy overwhelming public support as well as support within the medical community, but it is not the model that I'm seeking to pursue. And as the Health Committee in the House of Commons a couple of years ago concluded after about an 18-month inquiry into assisted dying and end of life, there were no examples internationally of a terminal illness mental capacity model morphing into a more expansive model, and nor indeed a more expansive model retrenching into a terminal illness mental capacity model. So, as I say, I understand why some may have concerns, but I think there is no evidence to suggest that slippery slope, so to speak, is a risk, because that's just not borne out by all of the international evidence that we see.
Okay, so what would be the procedure, the safeguards, and who decides in Scotland?
So, as I say, the eligibility criteria are that an individual would need to have an advanced progressive terminal illness from which they were not expected to recover. They would need to have capacity, and capacity in the context of making a decision around an assisted death. Everybody is presumed to have capacity, but this is a very specific capacity assessment. That assessment would need to be made by a coordinating medical professional, who may well draw on input from other medical professionals, whether specialists in mental health or indeed social work, who may have an input and understanding that could inform that decision-making process. They would then make sure that the individual was aware of what the prognosis looked like and the options that were available. So whether those are treatment options, whether they're palliative care options, whether they're options in relation to the support that might be provided through other means, whether through social care or whatever, so that the decision itself is an informed one. The coordinating medical professional would also have to, I think, satisfy themselves that this was a decision that was being made without undue influence or coercion, and that the individual, as I say, was fully informed. Now, they would then need to have a second medical professional who would go through a similar process and satisfy themselves that the individual met the criteria. There'd be a cooling off period of 14 days between when the initial application was made and when medication could be provided. That medication would be provided by a medical professional who, again, would need to satisfy themselves on intent and capacity before providing the medication, which itself would have to be self-administered. And that's a slight difference from some jurisdictions where physician provision of the medication is permitted. And at any stage, an individual can decide not to proceed. And as I say, in many of these jurisdictions, we see fairly consistently that there are those that go through the process of making an application, but then do not proceed to take the medication, either because they've changed their mind, they die sooner than they were expecting, or that the other palliative and care options that are available meet their needs right up to death. And
so can I ask then, just on that, the self-administering, what is that? Is that a pill or is it an injection?
It would be, in a sense, this will be developed through the secondary legislation to the bill. It wouldn't be appropriate to put that sort of detail on the face of a bill. But as we see in other jurisdictions, particularly Australia, drawing on the experience of those that have gone before, there's a very well developed protocol for the medications that are provided. And I think there are some likes of MND Scotland, for example, who have raised concerns about that aspect of self-administration. But again, through medical devices and technology, there are ways of self-administering that were perhaps not available even 5-10 years ago that would allow that as a self-administration to take place, albeit with a degree of support from the medical professional in setting that up.
Is there another model then that does self-administering assisted death that you're following?
There are there's the jurisdictions in Australia that have self-administration, but some of those also have the option for the medication to be administered by a medical professional in certain instances, and I can certainly understand and see why that has occurred. I took the decision in relation to my bill that self-administration was important. As I say, this is a bill about choice, but that choice goes both ways, and I've been very clear in the first instance that a conscientious objection was available to any medical professional. There was no need for them to participate in this process if they did not wish. As a result of amendments that were passed at stage 2, I brought forward my own amendments to move to a no duty provision. So in a sense, I think that provides a greater degree of clarity that nobody would be expected to participate in this if they did not want to. They wouldn't need to justify that in any way. There should be no detriment to them professionally, whether they participate or not. And therefore, I think part of ensuring that safeguard is in place is reflected in as I say, my choice to go down the route of a self-administration requirement as part of the bill.
Fraser, is that different to what Margot was proposing?
No, I mean, I think that is consistent with that, and certainly Dignitas, which I think is what most people will recognise or not know about. In Switzerland, again, it's a liquid form of medication which has to be self-administered. I was interested in the points you were making about MND Scotland, because obviously the counter to that is that people who have a physical movement impairment as a result of their illness then have difficulty in swallowing or difficulty in lifting a cup, for example, in order to be able to take that liquid, might be precluded from having an assisted death, or might feel that they, as in the current case with Dignitas, where people feel that they have to go too early because they still have to be able to travel and they still have to be physically fit to get there and then to be able to lift the cup. How you think that secondary legislation and other protocols might be able to overcome that problem?
Yeah, and I mean, MND are not alone, but obviously they have a very close interest in this aspect of the bill. I think in terms of those that access assisted dying, again, pretty consistently, it tends to be a range of cancers that the patients have. But the sort of second largest cohort of people accessing it are those with neurological conditions, and predominantly MND. As I said earlier, I think as well as the medication, there are medical devices that are now available that would allow for administration where there was a physical inability to pick up a cup and swallow the contents, as well as means of administering that in a way that I think was consistent with self-administration. As I say, the details of that really need to be fleshed out in secondary legislation. But
so could I pick up then on what you're saying about the workforce? Because I dipped in occasionally to the committee hearings, and we'll come on to the process here. If anyone thinks this hasn't been scrutinised, by gum, this has had, I mean, just that one had the RCN in, the nurses, and they were able to talk through the worries they had actually as whether or not they would be, just as you say, required to turn up. When you talk about this coordinated medical professional who's the one that takes the first decision, I mean, in England, they may have changed this, but this was going to be a judge-based system, which I think many people thought was just so cumbersome and wrong because it would be somebody that without medical training. Maybe that's changed, but here the focus is on this medical professional. Is that someone who's going to be a special? Is that a new post? Is that going to be trained for? Is that I'm going to say I am a coordinated medical professional for assisted dying? Is that my role?
Yeah. So look, there's a few things there. I mean, in terms of the coordinating medical professional, anybody that is actively involved in this process would need to have the requisite training. And again, the training will need to be worked up, probably in guidance more than in secondary legislation. But there will need to be suitable training undertaken, including training in areas where there's already sort of training required of medical professionals, but which will need to be adapted to take account of the process set out in this legislation. The fact that an individual has gone through the training doesn't necessarily mean that they would be expected or required to take part in the process. We see in other jurisdictions many who've completed the training, who are even registered to take part, but don't choose to take part for whatever reason. So that training would be essential, and it would be required of all those that are looking to participate in the process. So in a sense, it is a kind of opt-in model, because in order to be able to participate, you need to opt into undertaking that training. I think it's in relation to the bill going forward at Westminster. It's a similar process set out. It would be again based on terminal illness, mental capacity, and many of the other safeguards that are in my bill. That would need to be determined by two medical professionals, independent of each other. I think the difference that you're referring to there, Lesley, is at the end of the process. There is a panel. They've moved away from a judge-led process as a result of amendments, but there would be a panel at the end who would oversee it. Now, I've not opted to go down that route, and I think more importantly, that's not something that the Health Committee or the wider Parliament has, I think, seen as necessary. I don't think it really offers much by way of an additional safeguard, in that the two medical professionals, drawing on the expertise of psychiatrists, of cancer specialists, of social work, of social care, whoever it may be, to draw on that expertise on the circumstances of an individual, are going to be far better informed of whether or not they meet the criteria, the motivations they have for arriving at that decision, etc., rather than, in a sense, almost delegating it to a panel at the end of the process.
And are the BMA okay with that? Your way of doing it, or they're still neutral?
The BMA are still neutral. I mean, I think that's the important thing to point out. I mean, the BMA, RCN, a lot of the number of the Royal Colleges are all neutral on the bill. I think reflecting the fact that they represent members whose views span the full spectrum on this issue, and also many who haven't necessarily taken a firm view one way or the other, but who are, I think, keen to learn more, and also keen to ensure that certain provisions are in the legislation to provide them with the clarity and the confidence that they need, and also the clarity and confidence that patients would have the right to expect were they to go down this route.
Because I imagine these staff, I mean, okay, I came back hugely changed by three horrible experiences over 1 year. But staff who are in hospices or in wards where you're dealing with someone that's terminally ill, I know from my own experience that, many of them are faced with trying to decide whether to administer morphine at the end of life, which will, as many people would say, tip someone over the edge. So you're already facing these decisions.
I think that's an entirely fair point. And as I say, this is an issue that's not going to go away. In fact, it's only going to become more prevalent if we don't seek to address it now. Now, the proposals in my bill will not meet the needs in every instance. I think the expectation is that in the initial years, the numbers accessing an assisted death would be very small indeed. I've estimated it sort of around a couple of dozen or 30 or so, rising to 400, 500 after 5 years or so. Now, that's the trend we've seen in other jurisdictions. There's no reason to believe that will be any different here. So it's still going to be a very small percentage of those who are dying each year. But let's not lose sight of the fact that this is happening already at the moment, whether it's in terms of the double effect that you're talking about, Lesley, in terms of the use of pain medication, that it is understood may manage the pain, but will certainly, in some instances, increase the risk of accelerating death. We're seeing it happening with people who are accessing the services Fraser was mentioning a moment ago in relation to Dignitas. I think the numbers of those accessing that service over the last couple of decades, around 15%, I think it is, have come from the UK. So at the moment, we're outsourcing this as an issue. For those that can afford it, and again, as Fraser referred to, for those who are physically able to do it, and that often involves them going to Dignitas, certainly weeks, sometimes months before they would need to with the service available here. But far more people we know are just taking matters into their own hands. Dignitas isn't an option. The pain relief isn't an option. And the suicide rates amongst those with a terminal illness are over twice as high as they are for the population as a whole. And many of the stories that I've heard over the last 4 years are from family members who are suffering as a result. The trauma doesn't stop at the point of death. Indeed, very often that's where it starts and never stops. So not changing the law here has consequences, and that's the conversation I've had with many of my MSP colleagues over the last 4 years. I get that we need to get the detail of this right, but let's not pretend that not changing the law here doesn't have very serious consequences and leave people who are often left alone and isolated in a very vulnerable place without the safeguards we need. We need to get the safeguards right in the bill, but let's not pretend the safeguards are in place for some of the most vulnerable people in our society at the moment.
Fraser?
How do you read then the current tone in the Parliament? You talked about speaking to your other MSP colleagues. I mean, as a supporter of this bill, it's gone much further than any of the other 3 previous attempts, which have all failed at stage 1, I think. I remember maybe 2 years ago being at an SNP conference and Care Not Killing were there, and thinking that actually that the kind of mood music had changed quite suddenly. Things had been proceeding along quite steadily. Everybody seemed to be coming around to a kind of collective position that this was a thing that was required in a small number of circumstances. But then after COVID, with people being exposed to do not resuscitate orders, and some people apparently being on DNR orders that hadn't been consulted upon, and the kind of expansionism and some of the negative reporting coming out of Canada seemed to suggest there was a kind of dip in parliamentary support, if not in the wider public as well. And obviously, SNP is the largest group in the party. You've got the current First Minister, the current Deputy First Minister, the previous First Minister, Hamza Yusuf, and Nicola Sturgeon, all coming out and saying that this is not something they support. And whilst it's going to be a free vote, these type of kind of rhetorical statements do tend to sort of cast a shadow across the wider group.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, again, all fair points. I mean, I think the political mood has taken some time to catch up with where the public mood has been for decades now. Certainly over the last 20 years or so, polls have consistently shown that strong public support. I think the other difference, as well as the opportunity to see how this legislation works in other jurisdictions since the last bill that Parliament considered, the shift in the medical profession, and also those personal experiences. I think what we've also had is two Scottish Parliament elections. 2/3 of the MSPs in the Parliament now haven't had a chance to debate this or vote on it in the past. And they, I think, reflect increasingly that public mood. Many of them, and we heard this in the stage one debate back in May last year, many of them come to this issue with their own personal stories, and that's informing the way in which they engage with it. There is, though, I think, a difference between saying, I'm in principle in support of a change in the law, and then being faced with the task of, I think, scrutinising and agreeing the detail of what that legislation should look like, and I think having the confidence that it will do what it is intended to do, particularly in a piece of legislation where a lot of the provisions inevitably and quite rightly will be taken forward through secondary legislation and guidance. So the detail in many areas will come further down the line. But we're not charting new territory here. So even in relation to that aspect of the process, we are able to draw on the experience of elsewhere. I think in terms of the political dynamics, much is made of successive First Ministers' opposition to this, as well as the Deputy First Minister's more sort of public opposition in recent times. Obviously, the Scottish Government, like the UK Government, has taken a neutral position on the bill. In the vote back in May last year, more than half of the cabinet voted in favour, as well as many of the wider ministerial team. I think support within the government party was up around 60% of MSPs. But this is an issue that cuts across political boundaries. And while I think in the past, the views of the leadership may have had more of an influence over backbenchers in terms of just steering them in a particular direction. I think because of the fact that so many MSPs now have their own personal experience, they're speaking to constituents who are making it very, very clear of their own personal experience and personal views, and therefore I think that is ensuring that the very strong cross-party support that there is for a change in the law has held, and I would hope that's the case as we proceed into stage 3.
So just looking at the vote, it was supported by 67% of SNP MSPs, 37% of Conservatives, and 32% of Labour, which is surprising to me. 100% of Greens and 80% of Lib Dems. So, if you like, the left parties seem to be roughly, more comfortable with this. But 32% Labour, and I did wonder if Pam Duncan Glancy has had an impact there. I mean, she's a formidable MSP. She's wheelchair user, and she has been quite. I've watched her on various things, debate night and stuff, where she's been quite outspoken about her fears of coercion for disabled people. I see, however, you have had a poll that suggests that generally amongst disabled people, 76% of people support your bill. But nonetheless, has she had an impact, particularly, do you think, with your Labour colleagues?
I would have thought that is almost certainly the case, and to be honest, this is a debate that has been conducted in the serious, respectful, measured way that I would have hoped it would, and as the public, I think, had a right to expect it to be. And for it to be a genuine debate, you need to have views on both sides and in every position in between. I know a lot of my MSP colleagues went into the chamber back in May for the stage 1 debate and vote, still uncertain as to how they were going to vote, feeling desperately conflicted, maybe understanding the fact that the status quo was still letting down too many terminally ill Scots, but anxious about what a change in the law might mean. So this is a debate that's needed people to argue passionately their case and their cause. And Pam is somebody that I've worked with on this for for the entire duration, actually dating back to sort of June 2021 when I announced I was bringing forward proposals. I was conscious of both her position on the bill, but also that particular aspect around the views of those in the disability community, and she's been very generous with her time. This wasn't an exercise in me trying to sort of bring her around. I knew where she stood and broadly understood the reasons for that. But that has helped me, I think, in terms of trying to address concerns that they have, whether or not those concerns are borne out. And as you say, it's not just that the polling amongst those within the disability community shows broadly the same level of support as amongst the population as a whole. The detailed research undertaken by Professor Ben Colburn at Glasgow University demonstrates internationally there is no evidence of assisted dying legislation having a detrimental impact on disabled people in terms of disproportionately accessing the option, or indeed on their wider kind of rights. I absolutely get what Pam's saying in terms of the way in which many in the disabled community feel they are perceived by society as a whole, the extent to which either they don't have the rights that they need, or the rights they have are difficult to exercise and practice. All of that's entirely legitimate, but it can't be dealt with, I don't think, through my bill. It provides a forum in which to kind of air those issues. But I think denying terminally ill adults more choice at the end of life isn't going to enhance the position of those within the disabled community. So, as I say, this debate needs people to argue passionately for their position on this, and that's what we saw in the debate at stage one. I think even amongst some of those who are opposed, who've been disappointed at the outcome of the vote, I think even amongst many of them, there was a recognition that this was an example of the Scottish Parliament doing what the Scottish Parliament ought to be doing, taking a serious issue with real life consequences for Scots up and down the country, and dealing with it seriously and without resorting to the kind of usual political knockabout.
Yeah. Can I just skip back to something that Fraser mentioned there, which is these DNR notices, do not resuscitate after COVID, well, which have been on, they're used all the time actually in medical settings, but COVID probably brought it to the fore. I suppose that, there will be people, I hear what you're saying, that obviously a lot of the detail can't be carried on the face of the bill, but will come in secondary legislation. And yet, some people might be worried that you're setting in train something where the kind of the mechanics of the system as it stands will they think not be foolproof. In that, I also know people who've been astonished to discover a DNR notice on themselves, which hadn't been properly explained to them, or their relatives. And when you get to shortages and, staff shortages and all the rest of it, the worry starts creeping in a wee bit that what looks great on paper ain't going to work in practice.
I think it's an understandable concern, but I think it arises out of the lack of discussion and conversation between medical professionals and patients for whatever reason. I'm not sort of criticising anybody in particular, but I think what the bill I've introduced and the safeguards that it builds in, it is predicated on those conversations actually taking place. And as I say, at the moment, we know that there are many of those with a terminal illness who can't have a conversation with a medical professional about the option of assisted death for fear of the legal consequences for that medical professional, or indeed with members of their family for the very same reason. So we are isolating people. We're not allowing them to have a conversation about what their wishes are, what their fears are, and how those fears might be
For sure, that's as it is at the moment. I wonder, though, that was something also I was going to ask you, but lost it a little bit further back, which is, who initiates that conversation? Is it a health professional, the dedicated coordinated medical professional that has to get to the point of saying, here's palliative care, or who initiates it?
It's the patient that would initiate it. There was an amendment brought forward at stage 2 by Miles Briggs, who's been very, very active in taking forward proposals around palliative palliative care, and again, like with Pam Duncan Glancy, somebody I've been very grateful for the sort of generosity of time he spent discussing his work in that area, because I think there's often seen as a bit of a trade-off between palliative care and assisted dying. We need improved investment in and access to good palliative care, and that's not where it needs to be at the moment. That can't necessarily be resolved through my bill, but again, it's provided an opportunity to air those issues. So I think his amendment, in a sense, was a kind of no gag clause. And I think we need to be careful in terms of how we try to prescribe the doctor-patient relationship. Fundamentally, this is a process that requires the patient to make a request for an assisted death, and that's how it would then be expected to work. The coordinating medical professional would then be able to, as I say, discuss the reasons why they'd come to that decision, what the options were that were available going forward, including palliative care options, and then making those further assessments around.
So let's say I'm in hospital. I know I've got a terminal illness, and I talk probably first to the nurse, actually, because that'll be the person that's around me most. Then he or she will get the coordinated medical professional to come and speak to me. When you mentioned the things that they could consider, social work, psychiatry, are those a tick list that have to be gone through? So they have to talk to a psychiatrist about my state of mind?
No, I think, there were some that MSPs were looking for that to be a mandatory provision in each and every instance. I think that's inappropriate. It would be disproportionate. It would certainly, I think, constrain access. And I think some patients would take exception to the fact that they're very settled will, born of a view that they'd held throughout their life, that this is an option that they would pursue if the circumstances arose or would wish to have access to. I think they would take exception to the fact that for no good reason a capacity they're assumed to have was then deemed not to be held. So we need to have appropriate safeguards in for each and every circumstance. And I think quite rightly those in social work were making the case in the run-up through the course of stage 2 that we can't over-medicalise this, that some of that assessment is probably better informed by those involved in social work and the experience and the expertise that they can bring to bear. But as I say, it's a process that would be initiated by the patient's request, and then would follow a series of safeguards that aren't a tick box. Actually, they are far more rigorous. And were this legislation to pass, I think it would be the most heavily safeguarded end of life option, not just in this country, but actually internationally, drawing on that experience of what we've
just to clarify very briefly. Then I wasn't too sure when you said Myers-Briggs was a no gag clause. Does that mean it is a gag clause, or is a clause that prevents gagging? No, so the medical professional can mention it to you if you haven't quite articulated it in so many words, or do they have to absolutely? I can't say anything about it until you bring it up.
No, I think it was to try and to ensure that doctor-patient relationship is able to function as it should, where medical professionals are exercising their professional judgment. I suppose the example that I would use is if you are faced with a patient as a GP, for example, you're faced with a patient who's been given a terminal diagnosis. It may not have been one in the very recent past. It may have been a diagnosis that was arrived at weeks or months before, but who's expressing suicidal ideation and a real desperation at the lack of options available and the prognosis that they have. It's not difficult to imagine why, for that GP, there may be seen to be a benefit in the interest of the well-being and the welfare of the patient to say, look, the option of an assisted death is available to you. So look, let's be clear that that option is there. But let's look at the other options that are available, and that will allow you to manage the symptoms and the aspects of this condition that are concerning you. And so without the kind of no gag clause, there is a risk that the medical professional wouldn't be able to engage in a discussion like that, that seems to me not to be in the interests of the individual patient who's feeling very very vulnerable. And it's something that I think, back to the medical professional, BMA certainly have been supportive of trying to protect that doctor-patient relationship. And I think the more that this process, I get that it feels very different, feels very significant in terms of the change it's introducing. But I think the more that it's embedded in our health and care system, the more that the processes and the training and all the rest of it are consistent with what's already there in terms of managing that doctor-patient relationship, in terms of the training, in terms of the guidance, the more you reduce the risk of confusion and uncertainty about what's involved and how the process is to be managed. So we can put in place additional safeguards and whatnot. But I think
that makes perfect sense, because the opposite side of that, if somebody, an oppositional MSP, had introduced a gag clause, you would have to go to your doctor and articulate it in exactly the correct way in order to access the service. And if you hadn't really been aware that it was an option to you, you wouldn't be able to have the discussion that you're just describing, so that the doctor would be sort of legally prohibited from sort of joining the dots for you. And you know, somebody who deals with constituents, you'll know that many people come with kind of all of the right idea, but not the right way to actually put it over or to articulate it. So I think that makes absolute sense.
And I think it's to avoid a kind of rigidity that's not in the interest of the patient or the medical professional. This is a process that is predicated on the individual making the request. But as I say, as I've described, it's not difficult to think of situations where, if there is too much rigidity, actually the patient is put at more risk, and the safeguards that we would hope are in place, not just for those that are going through this assisted dying process, but those who are at the end of life, who are facing all manner of challenges and issues, are given the kind of protections that they need.
Can I just ask just two things lastly from me anyway? One would just be staffing. I hear what you're saying actually about, obviously professionals being able to opt out. But if I was running a hospice or certain wards in a hospital, I would need to know that there was going to be someone rotated on at all times who was your coordinated medical professional, so that, I'm not left short, essentially. Can people be certain then that they've got, if there's the ability by a health professional to opt out of at any particular moment, can you be certain you've got the staffing in place?
I think staffing is going to be a consideration, and ensuring that staff have the appropriate training. I think the assumption that this is a request that's made almost at short notice and in the kind of final hours or days, that may happen. But I think more often, and again, what we see from other jurisdictions, is that partly because of the reflection period, the cooling off period that's required. This is a process that's initiated earlier on in the process. So staffing rotas are probably less of an issue. I think in a hospice context, and I've had a lot of engagement with the hospice community about this, I can envisage situations where different hospices take a different approach. Some may look to help support their patients with the process itself. Some may simply enable access for those out with the hospice to come and provide the support that residents require. So there are different ways in which this works in other jurisdictions, and I think that would be a pragmatic and flexible way of seeing it work here in Scotland. So I think probably the other point to make in that context is that, as with health and care at the moment, we see differences in the way that it's delivered in different parts of the country. I mean, I'm the MSP for Orkney. We work very closely in terms of specialist medical provision with NHS Grampian, but also with NHS Highland, NHS Tayside. So I can see the way in which this is delivered may look different in the islands and parts of rural Scotland compared to Greater Glasgow and Clyde and the Lothian area, and that's as it should be. There's no point pretending that this can be uniformly delivered in exactly the same way across the country, but it needs to have the same safeguards in place to protect both the patients but also those that are participating in the process.
And so, where are we then with the final vote on this? Is it weeks away?
A date hasn't yet been set. My expectation is towards the end of February, but probably into March. This will allow some of the issues around legislative competence, because obviously there are issues with this bill that I've always acknowledged, touch on matters that are the responsibility of Westminster. Principally the use of medications and medical devices, but also things like the regulation of professional bodies. Those are UK powers. Now, I think credit to the UK and Scottish governments who, after the stage one vote back in May, were as good as their word in taking forward those discussions about how the legislative competence issues could be addressed through a Section 30 order and a series of Section 104 orders. So to allow that process to be completed through the respective parliaments, I would imagine that the stage 3 won't take place until March. I do hope, though, that at stage 3, the Scottish Government, notwithstanding its position of neutrality on the policy of assisted dying, will engage more actively in the amending of the bill that will still be required, because I think that is essential. There are things that really only the government is placed to help tidy up in terms of technical amendments, but also take forward in terms of the Section 104 orders.
So, I mean, we are coming up towards that sort of final critical stage then. I suppose there's also a risk that it could end up not having time programmed into the Scottish Parliament, and the Parliament winding down or winding up to the election and not being taken. So what sort of action, or where do people get more information? Is this the time for people to be actually physically meeting their MSP or writing to their MSP about their views on these?
Yeah, I would want to lay the fear that this is a bill that will run out of road. Yes, it is close to the end of the session, but I think there's a recognition across the piece, even amongst opponents of this bill. This is a bill that needs to be voted on for or against on the substance of the legislation, rather than on a process issue that it kind of ran out of time. So I don't think there is a risk there. It will maybe mean some late sittings and all the rest of it, but we've seen quite a bit of that of late, so that's nothing new. I think in terms of the engagement, but one of the aspects of this process that has been so encouraging is the extent to which the public have engaged. I mean, dating back to the proposals I put out to consultation in September 2021, where we saw over 14,000 responses to that consultation, the highest, as I say, that we've ever seen for a members' bill since the establishment of the Scottish Parliament. But we've seen on an ongoing basis the engagement that people have had with their MSPs, and that continues to be the case. I would strongly encourage members of the public to continue that engagement, certainly by contacting them by email and or by letter. But actually, if they're able to have face-to-face meetings, I'm sure my MSP colleagues won't thank me for that. But it's a process that's engaged the public. I mean, people understand why this matters. They come at it with their own, as I say, their own experience. And I think the other thing is that while there's long been strong political support for a change in the law, I think what we've also seen is a shift in the sense that it matters more to those people, that they are prepared to write to their MSP. They're prepared to, in a sense, cast their vote for those who are supportive of a change in the law. That's certainly what we've seen in the last couple of elections as well. And it's opened up those discussions, not just about assisted dying, but about end of life, about those things that Lesley was referring to before in relation to DNRs. I mean, that was a bit of a shock to the system. People do need to be discussing with their families, with their GPs, whoever it may be, what their wishes are at the end of life. The more informed people are of your wishes, the more likely the likelihood there is of those wishes being respected and realised at the end of life.
And just one final little thing here is, of course, when you utter, particularly for the listenership of this particular podcast, the magical words Westminster Government and Section 30, a lot of alarm bells start going off. Are you pretty confident that this isn't going to get Westminster saying, actually, after you've gone through all of this, no, you can't do it?
This issue has enough complexity and sensitivity around it without drawing it into the constitutional abyss. I think what this process has demonstrated, that where there's a political will, UK and Scottish governments have worked assiduously, both at a political level, but also at an official level, to take forward the Section 30 order and Section 104 orders in very quick time. The Section 30 order was laid before Christmas.
So it's been done.
So it has been done.
Okay, fine, that's fine. So the other small thing was this question of borders. I mean, should the Westminster Parliament fail to pass Kim Ledbetter's bill, would we end up with a situation where people might think Scotland's the place to come?
Well, there's a residency requirement in my legislation. So somebody would have to be ordinarily resident in Scotland and registered with a GP practice for 12 months. I mean, interestingly, my bill was introduced in the March 2023, and Kim Ledbetter's bill was introduced in October that year. And at various stages, my bill seems to have been further ahead than hers, and then hers has kind of leapfrogged mine and whatnot. Both, I think, are very similar in the approach they seek to take, but I've always taken the view that this is for the Scottish Parliament to decide and determine whether or not it's right for Scotland, for the Westminster Parliament to determine whether it's right and appropriate for England and Wales. As I say, we've already seen a bill passed in the Isle of Man. Jersey are well advanced with their own legislation on this, and as I say, there'll be similarities between all four, but differences as well. I sincerely hope that Kim's bill gets the support it needs and gets passed at Westminster, but I need to focus on getting my own bill over the line, and that's what I'm going to try and do.
Well, I think we wish you all the best of luck with that. We'll put a link up to Dignity in Dying Scotland so people can find out some more information about the bill, and also see how they can best place to take action at this critical time. I think to contact their local and their regional members of the Scottish Parliament.
Great. Well, look, thanks so much for your time, Liam. That's been a long, thorough discussion, actually, about the whole thing. But, I mean, nothing compared to the length of the committee stages and the scrutiny that Bill's had, which has been phenomenal. So thank you very much, and good luck with March or when it comes.
Thanks very much indeed.